So we're here with Jennifer Irwin. She is one of the authors, the co-authors of the latest Action Takers book, Leadership. Um, and it's part of Leadership Global, which is Linda Fisk's uh, group. And so why don't you tell a little bit about you, and then we'll talk a little bit about your chapter in this book and why you decided to join.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sally. So my name is Jennifer Irwin. I am a global HR executive. I've worked for a number of different organizations in different industries and have focused my career in mostly the area of transformation. And specifically, my purpose is to help both businesses and individuals make small changes that help them grow and pivot their trajectory.
I love that. I love that. And so you're part of the Leadership Global group, and you wrote a chapter or in this book. Talk a little bit about why you decided to write a chapter, right? Why write?
Well, it's interesting because my whole life I have been witness to my family, which I talk about in my chapter, and how they've always given back to the community. And early on in my career, I also gave back to my community in the form of when people had to do a resume, they'd call and ask for my help, and so I'd help them. Or they got an offer of employment and they wanted somebody to help them make sure they weren't signing away their rights, or they had unfortunately let go and they wanted somebody to help them make sure that they weren't giving away their entitlements. And so I've always been doing that. And when this opportunity came up, I thought, well, what do I have to give? And I thought about some of my experiences that I've had in my career and how many other women likely have had similar experiences and how I could help them through those kinds of challenges in the workplace.
Yeah, that often happens that we our story helps somebody else. The things that we've been
Hmm.
through, and a lot of times we don't see that. We don't think that, oh, well, no, nobody wants to hear my story, right? We think that in our head, nobody wants to hear what I've been through. But a lot of times people are going through the same struggles or the same things, and they want to hear how you dealt with it. So I love that, and I love that, the whole being of service and giving back, and it's so important in today's world because I think so many people are just, gimme, 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 and
Hmm.
nobody is being of service anymore. It's hard to find those souls. So, um, talk a little bit of you tell us a little bit more about your family and what that means to you.
So I grew up on a small farm, a small town, full small farm. We had 45 acres of grapes and 1,300 pigs. And so my very first job was probably well before the age of 10. And it was sweeping the alleys in the barn with this miniature little broom my dad made. And not because I needed to work or he needed the help, but I think my mom needed one of the four of us out of the house. So I started there and was always very competitive. I did gymnastics competitively, outgrew the girls' club, went and trained with the boys' club. If the boys were throwing a bale of straw 10 feet, I wanted to throw it 11 because I was the only girl working on the farm. And so always very strong and competitive. And I grew up in a home where my parents were very charitable, but not for the acknowledgement, usually quite anonymously. So my mom would, for example, knit and crochet blankets for the seniors to put on their laps while they were sitting in their wheelchairs at the seniors' home. And she would wrap them up so beautifully at Christmas, as if it was somebody that she loved and cherished. Like they were beautifully wrapped. And she would give them to the nurses at the seniors home and say, give these to the residents that will not have somebody with them on Christmas so that they know that they're not forgotten, which was so kind and thoughtful. My dad took a pig in and had it butchered and then gave it to one of our family friends who was on the school board for our school district. And there was a family in our community that was extremely poor and well and malnourished. And he asked the man who was on the school board to deliver it, but not tell them where it came from. And so I saw those acts of kindness and generosity. In addition, while we were working on the farm, we always, my mom and dad always had people working with us or for us. And so if it was raining out, and especially in harvest season, you have to pick, even if it's pouring, especially because it's pouring. And at lunchtime, my mom would have a nice hot pot of soup going. She was working in the field as well. But when we all came in for lunch, she had already pre-made soup. So everybody would have a hot bowl of soup to eat on a cold, damp day and take all of their rain gear and throw it in the dryer so that it would be dry when they went back out. And this kind of leadership, both as a business owner and as a person in the community, really inspired me without me realizing that's where it came from. And so going through this process of my career, I intuitively wanted to give back. I wanted to help. I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to help people pivot where they were going to go in life, whether it was an organization or individuals. And I know that now comes from my parents, but it has also given me a great deal of purpose and joy doing that in life and sense of satisfaction. So that's where I came from. And that's where my purpose developed.
Yeah, I love that. And our upbringing really does affect the things that happen to us in our lives and the direction that we go in. So, you talk about that you're currently in HR. And so, how did you get into that area? Was that the plan all along, or was that just something that you decided was something that you wanted to do?
Interestingly, we had family friends and they owned an employment law firm. And so I thought I wanted to be an employment lawyer. And when I went to university and I had a roommate who was in law, and it just seemed to be so much memorizing and sort of regurgitating of facts and things. I didn't really appreciate what kind of a difference that would have on people. And I thought, I don't think I want to be a lawyer. I want to have somewhere that I can build and create and innovate. And I had an amazing professor in my third year. His name was Don Cartwright at the University of Western Ontario. He was the best prof. We all loved him. In fact, we used to pick him up and give him a ride to school sometimes when we saw him walking. And his wife was an HR director at a company in London. And so he arranged for me to meet with her one day. And she spent 3 hours with me going through what she did in her job. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to be able to build programs. I want to be able to take a look at the business, where it is today. Where does it want to go? How do we make changes that enable the organization to get from point A to point B? And I learned so much of that again from growing up on the farm. My parents taught us a lot about business. And when the news reports came on, nobody talked because we had to understand what the price per corn or straw or whatever was, what was closing in the markets, and how that was going to impact our business. And so I grew up watching the news and having many debates with my dad and talking things over with my mom. And so I really had a fascination about business without actually realizing it until I got into HR and then really saw how I could make a difference to the outcomes of the business.
Oh, that's great. So talk about your chapter that you wrote for this book.
So my chapter starts off talking about my upbringing that I've already shared. And then I transition from when I graduate into my first, I graduated with my first job. And I quickly learned that textbook was the polar opposite of reality. And I also learned that how I grew up and how people give back and help each other grow and evolve really wasn't necessarily always part of the jobs that I had in the companies I worked for. And in fact, in a couple of companies, I had some really unpleasant experiences that just caused me to freeze. And I never expected anyone to do those things. because I would never think to do them to someone else. So when they were done to me, I just froze because I didn't even know how to respond. And in one job, I had a manager who would come into my office. It was a very much a male dominated industry, and he was of an old boys generation, and he would come into my office and start telling me dirty jokes, very vulgar jokes. And I kept trying to deflect and push it, like, move on to a different topic and talk about work and things. And then I started working with my door closed. um, and I supported all these general managers across Canada, and all of them were men, and they were fabulous. They all took time to teach me about their business and told me, "You're the first HR person that wanted to understand my business to help me be successful." And that doesn't mean doing everything they say. It would be like, "Okay, what are you trying to accomplish? Here's what the policy says. What if we could do this, which is in line with the policy and still helps you get to where you want to be, but it's a little different than what you want?" And they're like, "Yep, that's great." And so we partnered together really well. They were all respectful. And one time we were at a managers conference. It was a 2-day conference. It was near my home. And so all these managers came in from out of town to our head office. We had a really productive day. We went to the hotel they were all staying at for dinner that night. And then I went home to my house. Next morning, we all got back into the meeting room again. And the same manager gets up and says, "Hey, thanks for everybody's participation yesterday and the collaboration last night at the hotel. And hey, isn't Jennifer still wearing the same clothes as last night?" And his comment was inferring that I had stayed at the hotel and slept with somebody,
Right.
which
Right.
was not the case. And we had an internal messaging system at that time, sort of like a Slack or a Teams or whatever. And all of a sudden, I started getting all these messages from the men in the room. And they were saying things like, "This is horrible. I can't believe he just said that. We don't think of you that way. How can I help you?" Despite the fact that they all wanted to help and support me, not one of them spoke up and said anything, because they knew, as I did from an earlier experience, that speaking up isn't always easy to do and sometimes has horrible consequences. At one of my first jobs, I was brought in as the first HR person, and we had to do harassment and sexual harassment training. So I was like the first week or so on the job, and I had to go into this meeting with all the drivers, which were all men, and one of the owners of the business. And he announced to all the drivers, "Jennifer's here today. She's going to talk to us about harassment and sexual harassment training. I expect you to give her your full attention and participate. But before we get started, I'm going to kick off our meeting like we always do." And then he proceeded to tell a very vulgar joke about a woman giving a man a blowjob right before I was to give that kind of training. A bunch of people laughed. They all looked at me. They were waiting to see how I would respond. And I was so uncomfortable. I went, and afterwards, my boss said, "How did that go?" And she said, "Do you think you'll get this group on board? Because this is the group that we'll probably have the biggest challenge with." And I said, "I don't think so." And she said, "Why not?" And I said, "Because I'm going to call him Bill, even though that's not his name." I told her what Bill did. So she went and said, "We need to talk to the other owner," which I did. And he said that was totally, not called for. And he said, "Don't worry, we'll put a stop to that. That's not appropriate." So shortly thereafter, I started getting a very intense interaction with this owner. I was being ignored. I was being excluded from meetings that I should be at. He would make comments that were passive aggressive, and then one time he thought I was involved in something that I wasn't, and came to my office and started yelling and screaming at me and slammed my cabinets. My boss came in to want to see what was going on because she thought that there was somebody in my office trying to hurt me. And so after that incident was over, we went and talked to the other owner again. And then things just went quiet for a while. It was still intimidating, it was still uncomfortable. And then 2 months later, he smiled at me for the first time. And part of me thought, huh, maybe this is over. Maybe somehow he's coming around. Later that day, I was let go. And now I know what the smile was for because he finally won. After I'd been told what a great job I was doing, how I'd left an indelible mark on the organization by how much I transformed the HR function. But I learned early on that speaking up has consequences.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, well, you share those stories in your chapter in the book, and just why don't you just tell the listeners a little bit about what you want the readers to take away from reading your chapter, what these stories are going to do for somebody else.
So the reason I wrote the chapter is because at one point in my career, I met a gentleman who was a neuroscientist, and he taught me about the different parts of the brain and how they function. There's a really old part of the brain, the reptilian brain, that is the survival mechanism of the brain: fight, flight, freeze, food, shelter, clothing, sex, basic necessities of life. The mammalian brain is an emotional part of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex is the logical, rational thinking. In between the first two and the neocortex is this thing called the amygdala. And it's like a big radar scanning the the environment. And when it scans and it finds a threat, it immediately flushes red. It drains all the energy from the neocortex and provides it to the reptilian part of the brain, which is survival. And unfortunately, lots of logical, rational thinking doesn't get to the decision making part of the brain in that moment. That's why I froze. I felt so ashamed that as the HR person, as these horrible things were happening, not just to me, but also others, and not just by men, also by women in numerous occasions, um, that it wasn't that that I wasn't brave or that I wasn't courageous. It was that my thought processes were shutting down. And I think there's a lot of shame in the fact that you don't respond to things like you should. And so I learned that. I also learned from him that when that happens, you become anxious, and you that shambles your or jumbles your thinking. And so you're either living in the past or living in the future. You're worrying about those things. And the only way to stop feeling anxious and be able to calm down and think rationally is coming back to the present moment. And so you think of your five senses: five things that you can see, five things you can hear, feel, touch, taste, and sound. And so it's really about bringing yourself back to the present moment, taking a breath so you can reclaim your power to be able to respond logically and rationally. The other thing I was taught by a really smart woman who I worked with, and her name is Cami. She said to me, the next time somebody does that to you, you just stop and ask them, what were your intentions by saying or doing this? And in that moment, if they don't have good intentions, they got nothing to say. And so I want the readers to leave with knowing your responses are biological. They're not incompetent. They're not lacking courage. It's biological, which I think helps to eliminate that feeling of shame, number one. Number two, I wanted them to learn some tips and tricks that they can use in those moments to respond or to pause before they respond. I want them to know they're not alone.
I love it. So if people want to connect with you, Jennifer, how can they do it?
They can reach me at ignite results at consultant.com. So it's ignite results at consultant.com.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you for being part of this book, for sharing your chapter, and for sharing your story with me today.